Welcome to the Dr. Mudgil podcast. I'm Dr. Mudgil. Through this podcast, I will be sharing stories that I find personally inspiring and that I know will inspire you too. In this podcast, I speak with Dennis Mullally. Dennis Mullally is a career New York City bartender and is currently the head bartender at Otto Enoteca in Greenwich Village. I've gotten to know Dennis well over the past 10 or so years, and he's got a great story, which I know you're going to love. Well, I'm super psyched to have Dennis Mullally here for my podcast. I've known Dennis for, it's been probably over a decade. Dennis is the head bartender at Otto Enoteca, which is the quote-unquote casual Mario Batali restaurant in the neighborhood where my office is. And there was a time when I first started my practice that I was literally living in my office. And
actually, you were living at Otto's.
Yeah, and I would go to Otto almost 3 nights a week to have dinner. That was back when I was about 35 pounds heavier than I am now. But I got to know Dennis, pretty well. And, it's, to me, like, Dennis kind of has like this classic New York City story. He's, I know you've probably done things before you were bartending, but as long as I've known you, you were bartending, and I think you were bartending for a long time before I knew you.
I was actually supposed to teach high school history when I was going to college. Then I found that maybe I had a little bit of skill at standing behind the bar and listening to people or talking to people. It also was one of those things that it seemed like the first job that I wanted was simply because the staff was going home with who I wanted to go home with. And I looked at the fellow who was running the place and I said, listen, I want to try this. I want to do, and he looked at me and he said, you're out of your mind. You'll do it for one day. You'll get tired of it. It'll be grimy. It'll be dirty. It'll be ugly. I said, no, if you don't give me it, I was like a 9-year-old. If you don't let me do this, I'm never coming back. And he said, okay. So he placated me thinking I would walk out the door. Surprisingly, I sort of found that I maybe had a little bit of skill. It also, one of those things, and you've known me for the 10 years, you would never think that young Mr. Mullally was ever introverted or had a huge inferiority streak, which I did, which people I say that to now are like, who are you, a different person?
So when was this? Was this when you were in college?
This would have been in that early 1971, 2, 3.
A couple of years before I was on the planet.
Actually, the year, if it was 72, the year my wife was born.
Oh, wow. Where were you bartending at that time?
I was a young waiter bartender at a place called the Red Garter, which, believe it or not, back in 1972, 3, 4, there were 2 banjo nightclubs in the city of New York. One was the Red Garter, one was Your Father's Mustache. I managed to work in both of them.
It's like bluegrass, like a bluegrass bar?
Not even that, just banjos, slide trombones, washboard.
Oh, it's like New Orleans style.
We actually had a club in New Orleans, which one of the interesting things of when Mardi Gras came along, instead of hiring a bunch of new people down in New Orleans, what they did was they sent word out to all of the additional clubs, because at that point, there were probably about 8 of them in the States. And they said, okay, I need 6 bartenders, 20 waiters, this. And what you did, you made your way down there. They helped you with, if you got gas money, things like that. And you also wound up sleeping in the restaurant above that in a sort of little barracks place, but you were right on Bourbon Street.
Wow.
And so in 1974, I think I was down there. My shift started at 10 o'clock at night and ended at 5 o'clock in the morning, which of course, what do you do then? You go out and you get a couple of cans of Dixie and some red beans and rice. And then you retire up to the balcony and look for perhaps some young ladies who may be not wearing all their clothes at that hour of the morning and get some beads thrown at you. And the world could not have been a better place for at that point, 23-year-old Mr. Mullally.
Wow, that's... Well, I want to go way back before then. We're going to get to all the juicy details of your years bartending in New York City and New Orleans and who knows where else. But were you born in New York City?
Born in New York in March 3rd, 1951, where there was Women's Hospital up by Washington Heights.
Yeah.
We did a year in Manhattan, then a year or 2 in the Bronx, then Brooklyn, and then Queens. Then I moved to the West Village. But
so every borough other than Staten Island.
Other than Staten Island. And actually the one time in Staten Island, there was a young nursing student I was dating in about 1972 or 3. And we took the ferry back to her parents' house. And I am sure getting off the ferry, I saw goats. And these were not goats to help a golf course trim their grass. These were just goats wandering around, and Mr. Mullally knew that probably Staten Island was not the borough for him.
Was that your first and last time in Staten Island?
No, I think that I have been there maybe twice since. And it's a lovely place. It's just probably not for me.
So as not to offend any of the Staten Island
Not
listeners.
at all. I think that there are lovely people who live there.
So you started out in Manhattan, went to the Bronx. Were your formative years predominantly in Queens?
Brooklyn and Queens. But part of that was always based on, these days you find neighborhoods being gentrified and you have coffee shops and you have stuff. Back then it was termed changing neighborhoods, but it was the complete opposite end of the spectrum. There were lots of times in the young Dennis Mullally age where you had a mayonnaise sandwich for lunch because the dollar signs were not really there. I remember when we lived in East New York as like a 5 or 6 year old, they still had push carts out in the street. So you could, instead of walking over to the lovely Union Square Market now, there were fellows selling you heads of cabbage or lettuce, which there were also times that you would find certain teenagers who would hijack some of them and use them for stuff to throw at people in sort of gang fights and things like that.
East New York now is still like a pretty rough area. I grew up pretty close to that. I grew up in Start City, which was like, just, I guess, east of East New York.
We were on Alabama Avenue, I believe.
Was it a rough neighborhood back then?
I think, but then again, at that 3, 4, 5, 6, I didn't know.
Right. Yeah, it's all the same. Yeah. Do you have a big family? Do you have a lot of siblings?
I have one sister who is 8 years younger, who I love dearly, but we are completely different animals.
And it was just the two of you?
Just the two of us.
So when you were in East New York, you were 6 or 7 years old. She wasn't even born yet.
Not even born. When we moved to Ridgewood, which was that sort of Brooklyn-Queens border.
Was that an Irish neighborhood back then? I mean, there's tons of Irish pubs in that area now still.
It was Irish, Italian. Actually, the interesting part is then we moved to Glendale, which was that beginning of Queens.
Like it's Long Island, essentially, right?
Well, that whole thing, I mean, Brooklyn, Queens is Long Island.
Right.
But the last of the German Bund rallies was in that Glendale area. So I, as the Irish-Italian kid, because I always thought that I was Irish and Italian when actually I was Irish and Puerto Rican since my mom had been adopted by Italians, but nobody.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, nobody bothered to tell me that until I was like 7, 8, 9 years old.
Classic New York story again.
But it's one of those that if you weren't German, you were sort of considered, who are you? You're some minority group who just came in here.
Right.
The other part of it that, in terms of what your business is, when that skin tone of mine was still sort of tight and youthful, the eyes had more of an almond look to them. So I actually had, at 9 or so, some kid walk up to me and say, "You Chinese?"
Wow.
And I'm like, "What are you talking about? Who are you? Get it? Why did we move into this neighborhood? I hate it here."
Yeah. And then where'd you go from there?
Stayed in Glendale for elementary and high school. Wound up going to St. Francis Prep in Williamsburg, before Williamsburg became the classically chic.
So Williamsburg was it was like a very Polish neighborhood, right?
It was Polish, Italian, some Irish.
Gotcha.
And then if you went to the south side of Williamsburg, it was primarily Hispanic.
Okay. It's amazing, I mean, how sort of isolated the city was. Like, each neighborhood was basically a different ethnic group. Like, kind of like how now like Jackson Heights is like the Indian neighborhood, even though it's not quite what it used to be when I was growing up. But like you said, like, not being the German kid living in Glendale, it's like, you weren't part of the majority, which is just so fascinating to me because someone like myself who's Indian, I grew up in a neighborhood, I was like the only kid with brown skin.
Right.
And I had my own issues because of that, in the South Shore of Long Island. It's amazing how divided, like for me, everyone else was basically white, right? And even amongst the different, nationalities of, German, Italian.
Oh yeah. In those early years and I went to Queens College because I decided that coming out of Villanova and owing $12,000, which sounds so ridiculous now, you can't get a credit for $12,000.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do that, but I got a real education in Queens. But one of those sociology classes was, there's always that misconception of that melting pot. Everybody blends together.
Right.
It's the quilt. Right. It's like, my people
This
lived here,
here,
your people lived there. We did that. Now, there was some on that fringe where, okay, the Irish kids and the Jewish kids who played basketball together, that's what they did.
Right.
The Jewish kids and the Italian kids in Canarsie, that's what they did together. The Irish kids and there was always that sort of overlap based either on sports, music, somebody you were looking to date,
right,
something like that. But as you say, there you had that instance of everybody sort of looked alike,
right,
but you were still in some ways different.
Right.
But yeah, that other end of it where all of a sudden, you noticeably look different. And there's that, do I really fit in here? I'm supposed to fit in here. This is where we're all supposed to be, right? Which unfortunately, some of that stuff going on right now is not so good.
Well, if you were born in 1951, that means you were a teenager, like during the peak of like the Black Revolution and all these, racial.
60s were an interesting time.
And you were 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, sort of at the peak of developing your beliefs and stuff. I mean, what was that like in New York at that time?
It was, it's one of those things of revisionist history is always something interesting. Right now I can't have a real conversation with that daughter of mine and without getting into an argument of like, do we remove Robert E. Lee's statue? Or is George Washington and Thomas Jefferson really the heroes that we thought they were based on some of the other things?
Sure.
There were kids I played ball with who were black.
Right.
My father, who was...
Would you guys hang out together, though, outside of basketball?
Yeah,
so it's
because
just neighborhood kids.
You go to, when you're there, especially St. Francis was one of those, it's not a commuter school, but based on where it was in Brooklyn, everybody took the subway. So you were, walking onto the train with your duffel bag that had your football gear, and there were 5, 6 of us, or 2, 3 of us, but they were generally either mixed race.
Right.
It was still when some of the Hispanic kids, were not all Mexican kids. They were either Dominican or Puerto Rican or something like that. But it was, there were lots of guys named Cahill or Mullally or Rodriguez or whatever who played on those same teams. There were certain neighborhoods you knew you didn't go into. There were...
Just because they were rough neighborhoods.
Well, back then also, if you take it into, say, when I started tending bar in the 70s and mid-70s, New York, in terms of how we knew it, was sort of 1st Avenue to 8th Avenue, Houston Street to 86th Street. Everything else was different. Alphabet City was Alphabet City. Right. Soho was just some bunch of warehouses that maybe some people started going to. Harlem was Harlem, and I remember Harlem burning. There's a lot of stuff that you're around as a kid growing up that you think it's not right, but again, there's a lot of stuff that you, and not to be cross-referenced, like I was taught a certain way, like these people are this or this, but I knew the kids I played ball with, I knew the kids I hung around with. They looked different than me, but they were still the kids who were in the same classroom that I was in. And that father of mine, who was that sort of longshoreman, had certain beliefs.
Is that what he did?
He was a longshoreman and a checker, which means he was in one of the 2 of the worst unions of all time, which is why I hate unions, because they sort of breed mediocrity, I think. They were needed because management at that point was a horrible thing as well.
Very exploitive, yeah.
But
why was the union so bad? Like that particular union?
You know that when I tend bar, there is no such thing as that's not my job.
Yeah.
Go in a union shop and try and do something. It's not your job, kid. You don't do that. One of the things I almost wound up doing was getting my working papers at 16, and it was just as the last union contract, when the peers were already obsolete, that would have guaranteed me money just from going in. We'll do the story of what senior Mr. Mullally would do. You would badge into the hall where everybody met. And if they called out, okay, Mullally, go to Pier 40, Jones is going to 40, Watson's going to 40. None of those guys were in the hall. What you did, you got on the phone and you called them and say, okay, get your backside over to Pier 40, we got a job. Otherwise, you just got paid for doing nothing.
That's like that no-show situation, right?
It's like all of a sudden you see the construction
Sopranos.
in New York City where you got 14 guys standing around, 2 guys with a shovel and 1 guy's with a stop and slow down sign. Seems to be a lot of people doing stuff for doing nothing.
Yeah. I mean, things haven't changed that much. Yeah. So your dad was a longshoreman. Would you say your dad was like not very liberal?
I would say that he was conservative, but that conservative that used to be understanding. Again, people that he worked with, there were, back then the term would be, there were black guys who worked in the union. There were black guys in terms of that African-American person who also became known as sandhogs, the ones who dug the tunnels out for the subway and stuff like that. They were some of the first unions that were integrated. There's like a whole
documentary about that.
Yeah. Because one, it was that misconception that the African-American guys, based on who they were, could handle the humidity and the heat down in the tunnels. But those were some of the first overlaps of where you actually had white guys and black guys working together.
Right.
My father had that term where it was sort of like, there are black men who are black men. And there are others, and he would use a certain word, who were that. The interesting concept now is that with me at 67, that gentle age, and with that N-word being thrown around by people of color,
right,
I never understood, okay, why? And I talked to one of my Hispanic kids that worked about that. I said, you can sort of get away with saying that, but I can't. He said, no, you can't. The clearest definition I got was after Bill Maher opened his mouth with the N-word, was when, I believe it was Ice Cube, Ice-T, somebody went on the show and said, this is why you can't do it.
It's a word that has been used against us. It's like a knife, man. And you can use it as a weapon or you can use it as a tool. It's been used as a weapon against us by white people. And we're not gonna let that happen again by nobody, because it's not cool.
Because that term was always used to denigrate who we were.
Right.
But now we have adopted that term
as an empowering
for
thing.
ourselves. So you as an outsider can't do it, which I think that's what my father had said to me years ago of, you'll find people of all races, all stuff, who are legitimate people, who are hardworking, who are smart, who are just looking to make right for their family. And then you'll have those others who, whatever slang word or slur you want to do,
right,
whether it's donkey, whether it's womp, whether it's this, who will always look to take advantage of whatever and be that lazy person that those other terms connote.
Right.
He also was that interesting aspect of, in his conservative, and he was for a time in World War II on a destroyer escort. When Vietnam came along, and in his mind, this was probably around 68, so I would have been 17, 18
right.
going in.
You were up for the draft.
I could have been going in. He looked at me and he said, if you don't want to go, you don't have to go. And of course I looked at him like, are you the same person who raised me? And his reasoning was, they don't want to win this, or they're not trying to win it, and why am I going to lose my kid on something that doesn't matter? So for all of those times of me wanting to just punch him in the head over, for just the normal, I'm growing up, he's the male figure in the house,
right,
to that, I guess my father actually loved me and wanted me to be okay. It's how surprising some of those times when you least expect something where someone will just turn.
That's like the story of life, man.
Yeah.
It's interesting, just going back to what you were speaking to earlier. I just randomly was reading this quote by Nelson Mandela today about no one's taught, we're all the same on the inside, right? So no one's taught to hate someone of whatever, someone who's Jewish or someone who's black or someone who's Indian or someone who's Asian. No one's born like that. Those are all things that are taught or learned, and it's if you really think about that, it's crazy, man, right? It's
nurture nature.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Wild beasts, there are some predatory instincts that go on, but that predatory in that fact of we're mammals, we're animals, Somebody has taken that blackboard that you hope to fill with just learning and warmth and stuff that will make you a better person, and twisted it into that, no, these people or this person is bad. They're your enemy. Here's why they're your enemy. And or here's why even hurting them is not a bad thing, because they don't deserve to be here.
That's unbelievable, man.
Again, going back to Queens College, Saul Lutnick in one of my history classes was talking about people get the government they deserve. And he was talking about Nazi Germany. We, unfortunately, have the government that we deserve right now, with 40% of the people voting, and things that are going on in the media, and even things that are going on that don't even make the media attention. Scary times.
Yeah, that's a topic for a separate podcast.
As my wife and daughter would say, that's coming from an old white guy.
Yeah, who's like pretty liberal guy. So you went to Queens College, you studied history.
Yep.
Your plan was to teach high school history.
I was supposed to teach high school history. I wanted, from reading a separate...
Did you have a master's in, graduate, master's in education?
No master's, just a BA, because when I was on that 6-year program at Queens, because part of it was I was working
to get through
3 days a week, tending bar or waiting tables.
So this is when you were working at the banjo bar?
This was from the Red Garter, and then Your Father's Mustache. But then my first real waiting job in the West Village itself was at a place called Jimmy Days. Jimmy Days was on the corner of Barrow and West 4th Street, and it was that perfect sort of place to grow up doing what I do. There were a couple of characters who actually taught me how to do this.
What did they teach you? What is the art? Because it is an art.
It is, but the situation is, my 2 kids, when they were 9 or 10, could mechanically do everything I can do if they could reach something. I mean, a gorilla could do this, but the gorilla has to be able to get the people, to give them a reason to come back. They've got to be able to talk to them. They've got to be able to listen to them. They've got to be able to create an atmosphere where, even if the fellow or the person behind the bar is busy and doesn't have all that much time to pay to them, that there are other reasons that they come in. Whether it's the comfort level, whether it's the people who are at the bar also, who, it's like playing ball. You don't all have to get along. You don't have to all be the same. Matter of fact, it's worse if you were all the same. Back then, if you ran a cop bar, if you ran a Wall Street broker bar, if you did that, you want that mix of people, because every now and then, society goes in one way, the market goes in one way, and you could have a great broker bar, and all of a sudden all those guys are out of work because the depression just hit.
Right.
So it's that gift of being able to listen to people, being able to find something to talk to people about, and getting those people to be comfortable next to each other, where you also have to recognize when somebody comes in, you have 5,000 other places to go in New York City.
Right.
Give them a reason to come back. Just remember somebody's name. When we work our Saturday or Sunday afternoons, I know 40 to 65% of the people by name, face, or drink.
Right. Yeah.
It makes them feel reassured that this is a place they can bring people. And that's the way you work it, so that one person brings 2, brings 4, brings 10, and you wind up staying in business for 15 years.
What's the incentive? Obviously, I'm going to tell you about my experience out of it. We'll get into that in a little bit. But what incentivizes you to develop that kind of atmosphere? I mean, it's not it's not your bar, right?
It is. I always thought that it was.
Well, see, that's the right attitude, but that's such a hard thing to instill. The crazy thing about Otto is, I've been going there for a decade. The same exact bartenders have been there for 10 years. I sit at the bar, I see the same faces sitting at the bar for a decade. It's not always the same people, but I always recognize 1 or 2 other people that are there. And, we don't know each other. We've been sitting at the same place for 10 years, but we give each other a nod because you recognize each other, It's really something that's unremarkable. I mean, running a small business myself, I find that to be the single hardest thing to have folks that are invested in the mission of what I'm trying to do in my medical practice. And you guys just seem to, it just works. I mean, and I've never seen anyone who's not there. I've only seen folks work up the ranks. Like Uriel was a bar back and now he's a bartender. And there's this young kid who's there who's the bar back. I know he's gonna like graduate to being a bartender, but John, Frank, you guys are all have been there for, I mean, over 10 years. I mean, at least the 10 years that I've been going there.
It's one of those things that, especially with some of the Hispanic kids that we've had working there as back waiters, barbacks, who then go on to be waiters, bartenders, managers, somms. Some of the best feedback I've ever gotten is from some of those people who like what we do in terms of training people. Because you take these people, you treat them well, you start off thinking they got a brain. Actually, one of the 6 things that Mullally requires, you have to be able to say hello, goodbye, please, thank you, have a brain, bring a work ethic, and most people can't do 3.
Yeah. What are the 6 things again? Let's go through.
Say hello, goodbye,
yeah,
please, thank you,
okay,
bring a brain,
yeah,
have a work ethic.
Gotcha.
So we start off with that if I hire you, you're going to be expected to do that. And then it goes through the process of, I can be very difficult, but I will never humiliate you in front of people. I will hold you to certain standards, but because of those standards, you will grow. And I have enough weight in the restaurant community that if you suddenly decide you want to move somewhere, you want to do something, I can probably find you a job if you were one of Mr. Mullally's kids.
Right.
It is that consistency that's the hardest part, that even if I'm not there, it should feel the same, the product should be the same, and your treatment should be the same.
Yeah.
That's the hard part, because similar to you have a business that's run here. When you are not here,
yeah,
people come in, they expect to be treated that same way.
Right.
That's the hardest thing. And again, when you do it a year, 3 years, 5 years, 15 years, you're talking generations. And
yeah,
I mean, we've raised kids at Otto.
I know. I saw the little girl sitting at the bar
Yeah.
with her dad.
Yep.
You know, I thought that was like the most adorable thing, because 10, 12 years from now, she's going to be sitting at the bar with her friend.
She's going to be tending a bar with me.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. The other thing I noticed about Otto, which I find so unique, is it's literally like the most erudite bartending staff. Like, you know, 2 of the guys I think are like Ivy League graduates, right? Like Frank went to Penn.
Frank went to Penn.
John went to Penn or something, right?
John went to Enoteca,
Okay,
upstate. I went to Queens. It's also a smart bar. There are no TVs.
Yeah.
So I don't have people just swilling beer and looking at the score of the game.
There's newspapers.
There are newspapers. There's conversation. People talk to each other.
Yeah, totally. I always talk to someone. You know, it's amazing the conversations you can have there.
I mean, we used to have, when Sam Shepard was still alive and when he was living above Otto at 1/5, if he had a show going on at the Public Theater, after Sam did a rehearsal, he would come over and he'd be working on his notes or something. But Sam, and the reason we don't call him Mr. Shepard, Sam was Sam to us, would sit there and have a conversation with somebody. Somebody would sort of, not even if they knew who he was, but there would be all of a sudden this dialogue going on about whether, and it might not have even been theater or something like that. It might have been about horses, because Sam had his farm out in the Midwest.
Right.
Some other aspects of that. It was just, we look for interesting characters that there. We sort of try to cultivate those interesting characters. We will, I don't want to say tolerate or put up with some of those people who perhaps lack manners or something, but you know, there's a different, from Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some are a little more equal than others. You perhaps have a certain favored nation status there, along with some other people, but it's the way that it's supposed to run.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's such, you said this to me, it must have been like 7 or 8 years ago. You said that this really is a neighborhood bar, you know, and it really is. Like, you know, a lot of, I see, you know, some of the NYU professors, like the same folks that come, you know, I'm a neighborhood guy, I'm there, and like I said, you see the same faces all the time. It is very reassuring. Like, it's a place where you go, I know, I mean, my favorite time to go is when you're there, obviously, but everyone is great, and you know, everyone knows like what my preferences are. That I like spicy food. You know, like,
you want your pizza well done,
right? That I like it well done,
and maybe an occasional glass of red wine.
Yeah, and some Italian flags at the end of the day. Again, it's my friends will joke like, you like to just go to the same places over and over and over again. The truth is, I do, because I'm a creature of comfort. Like, after a long day of work, seeing a million patients, you know, you just want to like escape to a comfortable, familiar place, and like that to me is what Otto is. Like, you know, I only want to sit at the bar when I'm there, and just want to veg out for like an hour after work and then head home, and there's nothing better, you know?
We are one of those places that for the 15 years, we were owned by fancy guys. We have a very fancy wine list, but at very reasonable prices. But we're probably one of the best 5 neighborhood bars in the city.
Yeah. What are the other 4?
Right now, good question. There's one place, Peter McManus's on 7th Avenue, which has been there forever and which runs that same way.
7th and what?
It's on 7th and 17th Street,
Okay.
19th Street, something like that. But it's a situation where they've had sanitation workers, cops, firemen, brokers, fancy Chelsea people. It just works because they view it as you come in the door, you're treated well, you respond well, you leave, you come back again. That's the way the flow is supposed to be. I would have to think.
You don't have to name all 5.
No.
Yeah. I know they're out there. You'll tell me when I come to for dinner one day. The other thing that you mentioned to me, and this was a long time ago, is you guys were all working somewhere else together, right? Or a bunch of you guys were working somewhere else together.
We were at the Cub Room.
Yeah, I remember that place. It changed to something else. But
we opened in '94. That was actually the first place, or the first time I met Batali, because he was the chef partner over at Poe, which was a small little restaurant on Cornelia Street.
Yeah. He was a partner there at Poe?
He was the chef partner with a fellow named, I think, Steve Crane.
Oh, okay.
And I was...
so that must have been when he was starting out. Right?
Pretty much. That was, I think, one of the first times he was in New York and doing something on his own. But I was his middle stop before he then went over to see James at Blue Ribbon till whatever hour of the morning Blue Ribbon decided to close.
Right. So from the Cub Room, who was at the Cub Room?
John Moore, Frank Gaskin. Those were occasionally, every now and then, I would get somebody who was a waiter who stopped by. There was a lady named Nancy Seltzer. Seltzer worked with me at Cub Room as waiter, floor manager, and then later went on to Babbo, and then went on to become partner at Terry Lodge within the group.
Gotcha. Do you ever go to the other places, or ever need to go to the other places, like cover at Babbo or?
What we wind up doing is generally on Christmas Eve, Cindy and I will go to either Babbo, Lupa, or Casamono
to hang out as patrons.
Just to have that dinner before. Again, the only 2 days that we're really off on the holiday side is Thanksgiving and Christmas. And even she, because she's the pastry chef over at the Marlton Hotel,
right,
has to go in at some point in the morning just to make sure she's got product for the weekend.
Gotcha. And how did you guys meet through the restaurant business?
We met at position 2 at the bar. She was a patron. She swears that we met further down the bar, but I just didn't notice. And then she started to come in and made the mistake of perhaps wanting to get to know Mr. Mullally. But then at some point, the interesting part, she'll kill me for telling you this, but there was a time when the now Mrs. Mullally decided, I don't think we can see each other anymore. And I was like, okay, well, we seem to be doing okay. Everything seems to be fine. Well, it's just not working. I said, all right. Then about 2 weeks later, I get a phone call that, are you working tonight? And I was like, yeah. She, we came in and it just wasn't any fun in the back room. So at that point, she started to come back to the bar. We started to date again. And at some later point, I looked at her and said, okay, which of your friends told you that I wasn't too old for you? Which I later find out was one of her best friends who did. We have now been married 10 years.
Wow.
Why she did that, I don't know, because she is so much smarter and so much more than her husband is.
That's always the case.
Yep.
That's the secret to a successful, strong marriage.
I think.
When you acknowledge that women are much smarter than guys.
By far, not even close.
Yeah, but I could not agree with you more.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure my wife will appreciate me saying that. It is the truth. So just to take it back just a little bit, because my fascination with this whole story is like what happened from being like an English teacher to sort of being I guess a career would you say? Career bartender?
Very much so.
Yeah. That's like you guys are the only career bartenders I really know.
It's one of those situations that, early on in my life when I would look to apply for a life insurance policy, bartending was right up there with manual labor digging ditches in terms of how they thought of you as a risk to pay your bills. Then one of those interesting aspects, I have worked, if you drew one line from Sheridan Square and made a radius around it, I have probably worked 45 years within a 12-block radius of that.
Amazing.
So again, that's one of those things where the aspect of familiarity with people, because again, you're not moving to 86th Street and 3rd, you're not going to Battery Park, you're sort of in a central area where
people are going
a
to find
large number of those people are. But it was, I've had the good fortune to work in 5 places in 45 years. There was a time when first wife and I were living, after Blair was born, living in New Jersey, and it was a very white banker broker town up in Ridgewood. And
that's kind of a fancy-ish town.
Oh, very much so. And there was one time where she went to one of those junior women's club meetings, and it was in that 87 mini depression where instead of her husband in the transient sort of world of restaurants and tending bar, there were 8 seats at the table, and 6 of the women out of the 8 had husbands who were looking for a job just based on it. So I have been very lucky in terms of the places that I have worked, the longevity of what it is. And it's similar to, you can play the same, if you play golf, you can play the same golf course every day.
Yeah.
But just because you hit one shot a little different, it changes everything in what you do.
You must play golf.
Badly, and once upon a time before the last time I actually was on a driving range, took a swing, and then the next day my knee blew up. So my clubs have been resting in the closet for
That's how my back feels right now.
Yeah. It's just that situation of, I was not meant to sit in an office. Put me in front of a computer, there better be a fantasy football program there, because I'm useless for any of this stuff. But in terms of that, talking to people, listening to people, which once got me on a jury once when somebody said, "You're 10 bar, you listen to people a lot, don't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, we want him on the jury."
Wow.
It's that thing where it suits who I am.
Right. But how did you know that? Like, how did you know? I'm sure your parents, when you were in your 20s, were like, "Listen, you got to get a quote unquote real job and be a teacher."
One of those things, well, actually twofold. One of those things when I was a kid, probably 10, 11, 12, my father said, "You know what, one of the skills that I have, the real skill, I get along with people. I can talk to people. I can be," and I'm looking at him like, so? Who doesn't talk to me? Who didn't? And later on, I realized that's exactly what he was talking about. I can talk to, whether it's you as a doctor, whether it's somebody who's just locked somebody up, or somebody who's just taken somebody's garbage, or somebody who's looking for the spot quote on what Brent Crude is going for. And not a lot of people can. Yeah. And I also have that ability to, I actually listen. There are times I just want to shut you off, but there are times that I will listen, and some of that goes in. The other part of it goes back to that early New York where you could actually do what I do and live really well in the city, because in 1980, I was paying $450 a month rent for a 1-bedroom. It was 4-flight walk-up, but a 1-bedroom in the West Village on the corner of Bleecker and Barrow. Wow. Which probably, I mean, that building went co-op, which again leads to one of those stories of why Mr. Mullally shoulda, woulda, coulda done something back then. But there was also that alternative lifestyle. You got out of school. I don't want to go to work in an office. Why do I want to go work in an office?
Right. Or a school.
You got to meet people. You got to live well with meeting people. I mean, houses we used to rent out in East Hampton and Amagansett, you get a 3-4 bedroom house for $10,000 to $12,000 for the full year, not for 2 weeks in August. So back then, the timing again was good in terms of I was able to use those skills that I had in a job market where it paid what I was looking to make.
Right.
And I would work 4 nights a week.
Right.
Not 50 hours, 4 nights a week.
Yeah.
And be able to do all of that stuff while still going out and having the occasional drink and dinner, and life was not so bad.
Do you think that's changed?
Oh, the city is not the same. In the 70s, It was certainly not a safer city by any means.
It was like frankly a dangerous
I actually
city, right?
did not take an apartment. There was a condo building on Barrow and Bedford that there was an apartment there that the price was right. And I turned it down because, again, I was doing the vampire hours from 8 o'clock at night till 4 o'clock in the morning. And 2 weeks before, somebody I knew had gotten knifed on the corner. And I was like, I don't think that Mr. Mullally wants to be coming home at 5:30 over there.
Wow.
It was grimier. There was much more of a homeless situation out there. But it was fun. It was, you look back on some of those shows that try and portray what the 70s were. It was grimy. CBGB's was going. Soho was just starting to become Soho.
Yeah.
There was stuff and there was excitement, and you could afford to live here, and you didn't have 10,000 apartments just occupied by people who don't live here and are paying ridiculous dollar signs to do it.
Yeah.
And you're also getting to that situation where people who work in the city are being priced out of the city by those who don't live here.
Right. I'm one of them.
Yeah. And it's going to be one of those situations where, again, commercial rates and things like that. The fortunate part of Otto, when we took our 20-year lease, we still got in at a good number, but also the building had difficulties in the past in terms of who was in there.
What was there before Otto?
In the 70s, it was a place called 1/5, which 1/5 was that place similar to the Odeon downtown that attracted the cast of Saturday Night, the original stuff of Saturday Night Live. It's always been from that 70s, 80s period on, a building. Jessica Lange lives there, Sam Shepard lives there, Baryshnikov lives there. I mean, there's all sorts of people. Jerry Orbach always was coming in there. Then it became Clementine's in the mid-late 90s. And then it was empty because there was a certain portion of Clementine's when John Shank got screwed out of a deal, left as the chef, went out to Vegas, and then became the chef at the Bellagio. Where it was, okay, it's 4 o'clock in the morning, close the curtains, and okay, let's see how much white powder we can do and how much alcohol we can do. But they were still fancy co-op apartments upstairs, so they got kind of tired at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. People were rolling out of there as they were going for work. And it used to be that you had the entrance into the restaurant, but you could also walk through the main lobby at 1/5 and go through the service door.
Oh, is that right?
So anybody who lived in the building also could put their slippers on, put a bathrobe on, come down in the middle of the night and get a drink and go back up on the elevator.
Oh, wow. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So then it was empty, I guess,
It was empty for a little bit. Portale tried to put a restaurant in there, the chef from Gotham. And then Mario and Joe looked at space, had that concept of they wanted to do small plates, pizza. And at first it was just pizza and small plates. Then pasta came in because everybody realized, you're going to do this, you got to do it this way.
Right.
And the wine list, and that was us in the beginning of 2003.
So that brings me to my last question. All of you guys are basically better than sommeliers.
100 years old. Oh.
Yeah. How do you guys know? I mean, is there a class you take, or is it just from doing it, or I love wine.
Yeah.
I would say I know very little about it. I mean, I know what I like and what I don't like. You can put two glasses in front of me like you usually do, and I'll say I like this one better than this one. But that's just personal preference. I couldn't tell you anything about the grapes, but every wine you're like, is this grape? It's this from this part of Italy.
It's part of the situation where Frank Askin, who I work with, is much better at wine than I am. But Frank...
Did he take classes in it?
Frank, I think, just has always had that taste. I took a class with Kevin Zraly down at Windows on the World in 1986. And it was a great class. It was one of those classes where I actually didn't not go to class because I wanted to watch the Red Sox and the Mets in the World Series.
Wow.
I was going to miss the Bordeaux class. What are you, crazy? But it was...
That was 1986. So.
Yeah, but it was that situation of having that class as a sort of foundation. Having Kevin say, you know what, drink what you want to drink. This is not supposed to be a contest. It's not like... There are some people who use it as a way to impress people. There are some people who think that because of the bigger dollar sign, it's a better bottle of wine.
Right.
It's not necessarily true.
Right.
Which is, again, Frank loves Barolos and Brunellos. They are lost on me. I like bright fruit Southern. I like hearty rot gut Northern. I want something that if we're making beef stew or spaghetti and meatballs is going to go along with it. I also don't like to pay the price of Tuscan and Piemonte. I like a bargain. It's just what Mr. Mullally is.
Yeah.
And
who doesn't?
Yeah. But that whole idea of it's all repetitive, it's Catholic school, it's repetitive behavior. You try something, you try something, you try something, you try some different stuff. It'll give you sort of the framework of, I kind of like this grape I found, I kind of like this region I found. Okay, so this is what I'm comfortable with, but let's try something out of our comfort zone and we'll see if it's right for us. And there are times that, there was one week I did 13 shifts in a row, something like that. And I would have my little Cortino of Mozart going downstairs with me. And 9 out of those 13 days it was right. On day 10, it was the same wine, the same stuff, same circumstances. It just wasn't right. And sometimes it just works that way. It's a subjective thing. Your taste is different than mine, is different than his, is different than his.
But your guys, right? I mean, I 100% agree and acknowledge that. But it's more than that. Like, you guys actually know a lot about even the ones you don't like. You know about. I mean, does that translate into like French wines, California wines?
If you're putting Mr. Mullally on a desert island, I want white Burgundies and I want California Zins. That's what I like. That's what. If you give me those two choices,
I would never guess that.
That's what I want. But that again, problem. California Zins will hit you over the head based on the alcohol content.
Yeah. And
white Burgundies, you better add a zero to the $ that I make for a year for me to be able to pull forward white Burgundies.
Right. Unless Mario's paying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, man, I got to tell you, this was amazing, and I look forward to my dinner at Otto tomorrow night.
Done.
And maybe lunch on Friday, we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're not going to be there tomorrow, so maybe we'll catch up at lunch on Friday, and we can strategize about fantasy football this weekend.
Yes, we're not playing each other, so we can talk about it.
Exactly. And I'm not playing Cindy either, because I wasn't allowed to talk to you about it then either. Dennis, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate having you in my life, and it's been a fun decade getting to know you, and you've fed me very well.
Honey, this has been a great experience. I'll do this whenever you want.
All right, man. Sounds good. I might take you up on that.
Done.
Thanks, Dennis. Good stuff, man.
That was swell.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Mudgil podcast. You can find the corresponding video to this podcast on my YouTube channel and on Instagram TV, where you can find me at dr_Mudgil. Let's get it.